faces, I can always remember a face, but I have to think of a name to go with it often. But it'll come, but maybe that night or something.
Is that I have rather lost track of the continuity of time in the last, say, 20 years. I can't remember whether I did that in 68 or 72, or this happened before this. And I have a lot of trouble with that.
I now need lists to remind me, memory pegs or whatever you want to call them. Another way in which there's a difference is I can look up a telephone number and forget it before I close the telephone book. Now that's something that I would say has come within recent years.
I was talking to my wife the other day, and I said, I'm really having a problem misplacing my car keys. And she told me, she said, Yank, we've known each other how many years? Over 40 years. And ever since I've known you, you've misplaced your car keys. So apparently I've forgotten that I've been misplacing them all the years.
You'll remember
Memory is one of those human abilities which seems to change as we get older. With age, most people lose the ability to recall names or specific events with precision. Yet we may have vivid memories of other events. Laboratory study reveals that memory is not a single ability, nor are older adults destined to live in a world with fewer recollections of the past. Dr. Mark McDaniel of the University of New Mexico and Dr. Gil Einstein of Furman University are studying the effects of aging on memory. They're finding some interesting relationships between various kinds of memory and our ability to cope with memory decline.
Okay, a common assumption, at least in our culture, is that aging has devastating effects on memory, on all kinds of memory tasks. But the situation is actually more complex than that. It turns out that on some memory tasks, you tend to see very large age differences. On others, you tend to see small age differences, and in some cases, no age differences. And the interesting theoretical challenge for memory researchers today is to try to explain why some tasks are so difficult for older people and others are not.
We think that one consequence of aging is that as we grow older, we have less ability to retrieve information, that is, get information out of memory. One aspect of this idea is that if we test older adults in situations where there are not many retrieval cues, that is, there is not much environmental support for memory, then older adults will show poor memory performance relative to younger adults. In other words, older adults will have a lot of trouble at recalling information. On the other hand, if we test older adults in situations where there are a lot of retrieval cues, and that would be something like a recognition test, a true-false test, or a multiple-choice test. There are a lot of retrieval cues in this situation, and often older adults will show memory performance that's as good as that shown by younger adults.
Unimpaired on where the double simultaneous.
Most laboratory studies have been concerned with retrospective memory. This type of memory is concerned with remembering things that occurred in the past, such as the plot of a movie or novel, or perhaps the content of a lecture. McDaniel and Einstein were interested in examining something called prospective memory and determining if age differences in this type of memory could be reduced.
Prospective memory is a situation in which a person forms an intention to perform an action at some later time, and then the person has to remember on their own to perform that action. For example, it may be that you need to give a colleague a message later on when you see that colleague, and you've got to remember then to give the message. Now, in some prospective memory situations, it seems as if there are cues inherent that help provide retrieval support. If you have to give a colleague a message, the colleague serves as a cue to give the message. In these situations, we didn't expect that older adults would show memory problems relative to younger adults. In contrast, there are prospective memory situations in which there are few inherent cues. That would be a situation, for example, when I might have to remember to take cookies out of the oven in 10 minutes. In this case, with few cues, we expected older adults to show some memory problems relative to younger adults?
While there were existing theories that suggested that prospective memory should be especially difficult for older people, it turned out to be a difficult theory to test because there were no laboratory paradigms or methods for studying prospective memory. The existing methods were naturalistic ones, such as asking participants to telephone the lab 3 days later. And in that kind of task, there's really no control over how busy people are over the remembering period, no control over the kinds of strategies that people use. So we thought that an important initial goal of ours should be to develop a task where we could study prospective memory in the laboratory.
In this task, participants sit at a computer. They're asked to press the F12 key on the keyboard every 5 minutes while they answer a series of questions posed to them. They have no external cues to judge when the 5 minutes have elapsed. Therefore, they can lose track of time as they become engrossed in answering the questions. This is much like real-world situations where, after thinking about an intended action, a person can become distracted by other daily activities. In another version of this test, participants are asked to press the F12 key whenever a question about a president comes up on the screen. The presidential questions function as an external cue. This event-based task reminds them to press the F12 key.
In the experiment that we just showed you, we had younger and older participants in that experiment, and half of them were given a time-based task. That is, they were asked to press a key on the keyboard every 5 minutes, and that's a task where there's very little environmental support. And the other half had an event-based task, and that is they were asked to press a key on the keyboard whenever they saw an item about a president. And that's a task where there is an external cue or some environmental support. And just as we expected, we found large age differences on the time-based task, the one that was low in environmental support, but very small, and in this case, no age differences in the event-based task, that is the task with high environmental support. Beyond showing that the event-based task is easier than the time-based task, it's very interesting that we find no age differences on the event-based task, but we do find age differences on the time-based task. So that mimics the general finding in the aging and memory literature, and that is some tasks produce age differences and others do not. In our more recent research, we're finding even more support for this environmental or external cue view of remembering. What we're finding is that even in different kinds of event-based tasks, when the cue is very strong and very distinctive, very obvious to subjects, then we tend to find, in many cases, no age differences. When the cue is more subtle, perhaps appears in the background, it's not quite as distinctive, then we tend to find large age differences. So even in different kinds of event-based tasks, the strength of the cue or the distinctiveness of the cue plays an important role in determining whether or not you find age differences.
From a practical standpoint, this research has some interesting implications. For example, if you need to remember to take your library book back to the library, one thing you might do is prop that library book against the door. So now this becomes a retrieval cue as you leave the house to pick up the book. It may be that you need to remember to take medication. And in this case, you might associate a particular daily event with taking your medication. You might think about taking your medication after you eat breakfast. Another example might be to write things down that you intend to do later and display those notes in a prominent place. The basic idea is that anything you can do to build external cues into the prospective memory task, the more likely you'll be to remember to do it. And this is true especially for older adults.
Aging is not necessarily accompanied by poor memory. With environmental support in the form of retrieval cues, older adults can have very good memory. Memory researchers like Einstein and McDaniel are showing that this relationship holds up in a variety of situations.
Some of the things that we're interested in looking at in the future have to do with a prospective memory situation where the intended activity becomes more habitual, like taking medication. In these cases, the intended activity may not be forgotten, but what may happen is that the person may forget that they've performed the action and consequently perform the action again. This would be taking your medication twice in one day. And for older adults, it may be especially problematic to monitor whether they've thought about doing the medication or whether they've actually taken the medication. So our research and in the future will look at this kind of prospective memory to see whether older adults have special problems with monitoring their memory.